The darkness comes, an eternal darkness-based fic. Chapter 2. Influencing Fate. Michael Edwards quietly entered the foyer of the Roivas estate. He did it cautiously, even though the goddess was still doing what she could to protect them. An illusion of a raging fire kept many away from the estate, including those that were followers of Mantarok. That was a truth he had learned over his time hiding from the forces of Pius Augustus years ago. As he moved through the foyer, his main reason for being there was to wait for the return of Richard Cale. He was to return soon from his mission, which was finding one of the people the goddess was certain would help them. Usually it was either Richard or Alexandra Roivas who went on these missions. However, each mission had gotten more and more difficult over the months. Seeing any number of their already small numbers get captured or killed by Mantarok's forces was not a good thing. Being a seasoned veteran, he had seen a good many good people die. But after the mission in the Middle East and his discovery of the otherworldly forces, every death made him wonder. Every death even saddened him, wondering if it was just one, or one of those who were already dead. His exposure to those horrors had caused him to no longer be surprised by the strange and unusual. In fact, whenever one of the creatures exposed themselves, he wasn't surprised. One thing that did manage to surprise him was when the front door burst open and Richard Cale came running in, quickly shutting the door behind him. The sheer speed at which it was all done was enough to worry Michael. As his friend paused long enough to catch his breath, he walked over to him, asking the question on his mind. "Did something happen this time in the city?" He watched as Richard nodded, and then started to head to the basement door. "Yeah, I had a near-close run-in with Lucinda Tepes and one of her minions. It was one of Mantarok's bone thieves. They are more fearsome than the others, and can even talk. It's not a good sign. I hope there's some good news here." Michael followed him and nodded, even though Richard wasn't looking at him. "That is a problem. However, your wife and father-in-law made a discovery in Inga. They aren't sure what it is yet, but it is something big." As they entered the basement, he felt a bit safer. The main estate's only security was the illusion that it was on fire, and if things were escalating, it would mean that the illusion might not hide them anymore. As they descended to the top of the stairway that led down to Enga, they both heard the voice of the goddess speak to them. "That discovery came at the right time, as its purpose will be revealed soon. It will also help bring those Richard had contacted here, as well as others who will help defeat Mantarok." He took a deep breath after the goddess spoke. The words gave hope, but also a sense of foreboding. They stopped for a moment at the balcony that overlooked the underground city, and he thought back to his arrival at the mansion. At that time, only a small patch of the city glowed with the friendly yellow light. Now more of the city glowed yellow, showing where those who were ready to fight the darkness dwelled, and the growing safe zone of the goddess. He then looked at the rune on the balcony, and it made him realize how safe they were now. He pointed down to the floor and said, "There is some good news. The goddess's barrier now reaches up here. I doubt any of Mantarok's minions will make it into Enga now." He watched as Richard nodded, and then said, "Seems that way. But I won't really relax until Mantarok is stopped. Besides, we now know a bone thief aligned to Mantarok exists. But does the Ancient also have gatekeepers? Horrors and other creatures? If that's the case, people are going to start seeing these things more and more." Hearing Richard say that worried Michael, but as they started down the rest of the steps, he felt a feeling of peace and security come over him. He also noticed that Richard seemed to relax a little as well. However, he had a feeling that relaxing might not be an option right away, since they needed to head to the new discovery. Yvette Kale looked around the strange building that she and her father had come across while exploring Enga. Ever since her father's arrival in the underground city and the growing power of Mantarok's followers, exploring the city became a pastime for her. It helped her keep her sanity during these trying times. In fact, it made her happy to be exploring ancient structures with her father and to dress in archaeological gear again. The only downside was her old clothes wouldn't fit proper anymore, since they were before she had become the woman she was now. She had to modify them, but it had proved that while they were not normally practical, her husband had loved the outfit. Right now, however, she had wished she had something nicer, since it wasn't just her father and herself here at the latest discovery. After they had found it, Alexandra Roivas was with them, as well as some of the other people who had made their way to the city. If it had just been Alexandra joining them, she wouldn't have minded, since the last of the Roivas family, who had been fighting the Ancients for years, still liked to wear her black tank top and black pants. Like Yvette's current outfit, it highlighted Alexandra's figure, but since Yvette was married, she didn't want a lot of people looking at her figure, just her husband. She was brought out of those thoughts when her father said something of interest. Since he had returned with Alexandra and some of the others, he had been looking over what looked like a console and a huge rock sphere. Like almost everything in the city, they looked like modern equipment, but worked off magical energy. She went over to her father's side and asked, "What did you say, Father?" She watched as he turned to face her and answered, "Right here, it looks like these had preset coordinates on them. Some appear to be close by, while others appear to be halfway around the globe. It's as if this is part of some sort of teleportation system, like those mentioned in those science fiction shows." She looked at what he was talking about and realized he was correct. In fact, she noticed one set of numbers in one corner, and further confirmed her father's thoughts. "You're right. This here has to be our coordinates. And here's another set not too far from here." She even noticed coordinates that appeared to be on the other side of the globe, but didn't mention it. She did realize what the discovery truly meant. It was Alexandra who voiced the thought then. She watched as Alexandra looked at the console as well and said, "If this is a transport system, that means we wouldn't have to keep sneaking out through the illusion of the burning mansion. If things are picking up, we can't keep using the mansion." She watched as Alexandra turned to look at both her and her father. "Do you think we'll need to use the array to get this thing started?" Before she could even answer the question, she was startled to hear her husband speak, since she wasn't aware he had returned. "We may need an answer to that one quickly. I just narrowly avoided a bone thief of Mantarok, as well as the full attention of Lucinda Tepes." Hearing those words sent a chill through her, since they were all aware of how Lucinda moved in after Pius Augustus was defeated. It had been her company that bought up all the holdings of Pius's one alter ego, Paul Augustine. In fact, it was Lucinda who had said that her father was responsible for Paul's death. She was broken out of her thoughts when Alexandra spoke. "What happened? Don't you usually use the goddess's version of the invisibility spell? Didn't we figure that it worked for a few hours?" She nodded, remembering how they had tested it. It had been a huge success, and they could get some things the goddess could not provide for them. She then noticed that Michael was with her husband as well. "From what he told me, Lucinda had noticed him, but then got distracted. However, it appears that bone thieves can now see through the invisibility. Richard even said that this one could talk while not in the skin of its victim." She gasped when she heard that. From what she remembered during the reading of the Tome of Eternal Darkness, the creature's only noise had been a hiss. This news meant that Mantarok's creatures had some surprises they were not ready for. Her thoughts were then interrupted by the ethereal voice of the goddess. "I know you have all heard some disturbing news, but we must act quickly or many allies will be lost. Someone must place their hand on the corner of the console, as you have dubbed it, to activate the portals. The ones that Richard has contacted are now in grave danger. The portal closest to them should be obscure to most of Mantarok's minions, including Lucinda and the horror she summoned." Without missing a beat due to the horrifying news she just heard about the horror, Yvette quickly ran over to the console, only to see her father already putting his hand on the spot. Soon 2 portals lit up, and one had the coordinates lit up that she noticed earlier. Before she could voice her concerns about the other tunnel, she heard the goddess speak again. "The other portal will allow another chosen one to arrive here. The others that need help may need to be defended." She watched then as Alexandra headed into the portal, and she quickly followed. Just as her husband moved forward, she turned and said, "Wait here. Alexandra and I can handle ourselves." She watched as her husband nodded, and then smiled at him before entering the portal. After a moment of nothing but bright yellow light, she realized they were in a dimly lit tunnel. She looked around, seeing that the portal was the only source of light, and that at the end of the tunnel she saw lights. Before she could say anything, she heard Alexandra say, "This is a subway station in town. The tunnel must be hidden by an illusion. Let's remain quiet and watch." She nodded and waited. She also wondered how the others would see the tunnel and even react to their appearance, since they were considered criminals thanks to Mantarok. In Amiens, France, the church was at work restoring Oubliette Cathedral, and Bishop Philippe was glad to be overseeing the work. He had grown up in Amiens, and even though his parents had told him to always be proud of where he came from, he never understood why his parents always went to church in another town. His grandparents had told him the cathedral was not clean, and when he heard of the restoration effort, he wanted to be at the lead of it. As of right now, workmen were working on repairing the windows, They had been shattered during World War I, but that was after the British troops had left. Some had even said that spirits of the wounded that had been in the cathedral were still haunting the place. That was another thing he didn't believe was true. But as a precaution, an exorcism had been done on the building. With all that having been done, Philippe was certain the restoration would continue to go well. They had even managed to get into the old tower and start in on fixing it. He had been surprised when some of the workmen told of an odd hissing in the old tower, since he was certain that no pipes or anything had been put in over there. It was the only part of Oubliette Cathedral that he had yet to visit, except for the crypts under the cathedral. He was just about to head through the main cathedral when a calm voice spoke softly, but with a power that said, "Listen. Philippe, my son, how are things going?" He turned and was stunned to see that he was face to face with His Holy Eminence, the Pope. He quickly bowed, honored to be graced with a visit, and surprised as well. "Your Holiness, I was not aware that you would be visiting. Have you come for a tour of Oubliette Cathedral?" He was stunned when the Pope shook his head. However, he could tell that the Pope must have been there for some reason. He quickly motioned back to where he had set up his office, right off the antechamber. "Please, if you wish to talk, then come to into my office." He was happy when the Pope nodded, and then entered into the office. But oddly enough, he motioned for those with him to wait outside. He quickly followed the Pope into the office and closed the door. It was unusual for the Pope to go anywhere without a guard after what had happened years ago. Once the door was closed, however, Philippe watched as the Pope looked around for a moment, and then spoke softly, as if he thought someone was listening in. "My son, are you aware of how important you are?" Philippe nodded and was surprised when the Pope shook his head. "No, you are not yet aware of how important you are. I wish I had more time to tell you all, but I feel I must tell you all I can before it is too late." Those words made his blood freeze. It sounded to him that the Pope's days were numbered, but he didn't want to think that. He slowly approached the Pope, hoping to comfort him. He stopped when the Pope raised his hand, signaling him to stop moving, before he continued. "You have a very special place in the history of the Church, nay, even the history of the world. However, you need to heed my words if you wish to survive." Philippe nodded, feeling almost overwhelmed by the matter. He took a deep breath and then said, "Of course, but my work here has only just begun. There is still much to do in restoring this cathedral. We have only just begun work in the old tower." He was stunned when the Pope raised his hand and shook his head. It was as if the Pope was saying the restoration was not the task he was meant to take part in. Before he could question the Pope, the elder clergyman looked around for a moment, and then leaned forward, whispering his next words. "You must head to the old cloakroom and climb down into the catacombs. You will know which way is the proper way to go. It was the location of great heresy long ago, but in light of recent events and research into the Vatican Library, I have found that nothing was untouched by the heresy. Long ago our faith was free of it, until it made its way into it. Deep down, in what appears to be an unholy hall, is the way to find those who can help." He was stunned by those words, and even began to wonder about the mental health of the Pope. However, before he could protest, the Pope continued, "I will not lie to you, but as proof of what I said, I will tell you that those who came with me make an unearthly hiss, similar to the one I'm sure they said came from the old tower." Philippe was taken back by that statement. He looked at the Pope and quietly asked, "How did you know about that? We all thought it was something in the pipes." He was stunned when the Pope just sighed. "Over the years, the Church has known something was happening here, something evil. We thought it had been gone after the Inquisition ended. It took us far too long back then to realize the evil had been linked to it, but we were afraid to admit it. We even thought it was gone, until reports of the demons came during World War I. However, each of those stories also carried word of a strangely dressed holy warrior who fought the demons and used their own powers against him. That person exists now and is accused of crimes I am sure he did not commit. You must go to them." Philippe was taken back by that. He had been following some of the news in the world, but the thought of associating with a criminal seemed wrong to him. He even had to admit that the claim seemed outlandish when it was associated with a holy warrior. He gave the Pope a look, and in that moment he saw that the Pope was certain about what he said. There was a look in his eyes that said that. He sighed then. "If that is the case, what am I to do?" He watched as the Pope handed him an odd key. "Take this key and head to the cloakroom. It holds the entrance to the catacombs now. Trust your faith, and you will find your way to the door it unlocks. At the end of a long hall, the path to those who need your help will be found. Now go, for if I am right, those who came with me will soon be here to kill me. If all goes well, you will be where you need to be. Go, my son." Philippe nodded and ran out of his office. He was somewhat surprised not to see the Pope's bodyguards there, but if the Pope was right, they were not there to help him. He then ran into the cathedral, and listening to his faith, he remained in the shadows. He made his way to the cloakroom and quietly entered. However, as he entered, he heard a hiss come from the front of the cathedral, and a voice shout, "His Eminence has been murdered! We just found him in the bishop's office!" His heart fell, and he quickly closed the door and made his way to the ladder. He was sure the Pope was speaking the truth now. He even could see how it would be viewed by others. They would blame him, and he would be disgraced in the church. He quickly made his way down through the catacombs, all the while thinking that if he had remained, could he have prevented the death, or would he have been killed? He eventually concluded that it would not have mattered. He was almost surprised when he reached the locked door and saw the odd markings on it. He looked at the key and noticed the same markings. He paused for a moment, wondering if he should dare turn back. However, as he looked behind, he noticed something for the first time. There had been a few bodies not fully interred, and they had started to move. All looked like they were walking skeletons, and all seemed to stare right at him. Fright took over, and he quickly got through the door and barred it. He then ran through the next hall and down the steps, noticing that bodies there had started to rise as well. He kept his faith as he ran in fear until he reached a large open hall with heretic carvings on the side. He also noticed it was the only room without bodies in it, but a huge hole at the far end. He noticed something else. Where the remains appeared of a missing, stained window, there was a glow. There was something comforting in that glow, and as he moved down the hall, he heard a voice say, "It is safe. Enter the light, and you will be with others. They will explain once you arrive." Bishop Philippe thought about it for a moment, wondering if he should trust the voice. Logically, he felt it was not a wise thing to do, but as the Pope had said, he had to trust his faith. He slowly walked forward and carefully around the pit before he stopped right in front of the portal. He then looked back at the far end of the hall, wondering how long the hall would remain safe. Would the forces that killed the Pope be kept at bay by the creatures? He finally decided that he had to trust his faith, and he closed his eyes and stepped into the glowing light. James Mulroy ran from the dorm, clutching the few items he could pack into a duffel bag. He had gotten an outfit or two, a few of his books, and a few other necessities. He was glad his roommate wasn't in at the time, but in a class. It made it easier to grab the items. The way Professor Marsh had spoken, they were going to disappear. However, he felt Professor Marsh was right about very bad things coming, and that if they hoped to survive, they needed to find those that also knew about what was coming. As he headed towards where Professor Marsh usually parked his car, his attention was drawn to something at one of the girls' dorms. It was the girl he had seen earlier, and she appeared to be running from someone. He had heard of her before, and never got to speak with her, but he had heard of her reputation. He started to wonder if she found a guy who wanted more than what she would do. Those thoughts, however, left him when he saw what came out of the dorm she had ran out of. The thing was huge, with 3 apparent heads-like parts. Each was a specific feature, and it was after the girl. The fact that she was running from it told him that she saw it, and most likely would be another person that Mantarok must feel is a threat. When she tripped, he knew what he had to do. He quickly ran over and caught her in mid-trip, allowing her to keep moving. "Come on, I know someone who can help you get away." As they ran, he heard her say something that surprised him. "You know someone who knows how to fight a horror, or at least knows what it is?" When he nodded, he heard some relief in her voice. "I first thought only my great-grandfather made up those stories, but if others know about them, then help me get to them. That thing wants to kill me." At that moment, he heard a spark of lightning behind them, and saw the thing had just struck where she had stumbled. He kept moving with her as he spoke to her. "I don't think it cares if it kills just you or not, but I have some bad news. I think we are the only ones who see it." He heard her groan at that, as if she didn't want to hear that news. When she spoke, he understood why. "That thing killed a guy, and when people see it, they'll blame me." It was then he noticed how she was dressed, and he realized that the reputation she had wasn't mere talk. At least he was thankful that she had something on. As they ran, he then saw Professor Marsh in his car, and he could tell the engine was running. As they neared, he saw Professor Marsh get out just for a second, saying, "You better get in quick. It looks like something is already after us." They stopped long enough to get into the back of the car, and he said to the professor, "We already know it was after her. Just drive once we close the door." He let her get in first, and then quickly followed. Once he had the door closed, he felt the car accelerate, and they were leaving the campus. He looked back only once and saw the horror, as the girl had called it, was still following them, but given its size, he was surprised that it was keeping up with the car. It wasn't a comforting thought that it could keep up, but before he could voice his concern, he heard Professor Marsh address the girl. "Pardon, miss, but who are you, and why is that monstrosity after you?" He looked at the girl for the first time since helping her. It was at that time he remembered her name and answered his favorite professor's question. "She's Marlene Jacobs. I can't say I know her, but she seems aware of what that thing following us is." He noticed the startled look she gave him, but ignored it. He did notice, by the way of the rearview mirror, that Professor Marsh's eyebrows raised. "Wait, are you related to Peter Jacobs?" When she nodded, he realized that it was important, especially when Professor Marsh continued. "Dr. Roivas once told me about him. He was at Oubliette Cathedral back in World War I, when he came across the Ancients' plot. He returned with one of their essences. That's why she knows about the creature. He probably passed the knowledge on." He was stunned when Marlene let out a sound. "Fat lot of good it did me. He always talked like the world would end. I never thought he was serious about the creatures. He even said some guy helped him fight them." James wanted to ask on that, but at that moment he noticed a spark come from the creature, and soon one of the tires exploded. It was by luck that the car didn't go out of control. It did come to a stop, and a slight panic started to fill his soul. It appeared they were in a slightly open part of town. There wasn't any place they could hide from the creature, and it was still coming. All of a sudden, he swore he heard the same voice he heard when he first saw Richard Cale. He also noticed that Professor Marsh and Marlene heard it as well, as they both had a stunned look on their face. "There is a way to safety nearby. Go there, and you will be saved." He glanced out the car window and saw it. He also noticed that the others saw it as well. It was the entrance to the city's subway system. He looked at them and heard the roar of the creature. They all nodded, and then he, Professor Marsh, and Marlene got out of the car. Just as they did, he remembered that he left his bag in the car. He was about to turn back when a brief yellow glow appeared in the car, and a purple bolt of lightning came towards the car. He turned and ran back towards the others, just before the bolt hit the car, causing the trunk to explode open. If he had not turned around when he did, he would have been killed. However, he hoped that monstrosity would not be able to follow them into the subway, and if it did, he hoped that their hiding spot would not be discovered. Amber Snow had just arrived at one of the city's nicest restaurants. It was not some place she could normally afford to go to, but a friend of hers, Lucinda Tepes, was paying. Lucinda was one of the few friends she had kept in touch with, but was also one of the more difficult ones to get along with. Most times, it always came down to religion. Amber was a devout Wiccan, and while she never knew her friend's religious following, she felt it was one of those that would not accept a Wiccan. As she was escorted to the table, she noticed that the place wasn't very busy at all, which she thought was very odd. For many places, this was one of the busiest times of day. It also put her nerves on edge, since it seemed surreal. She then put in her mind that any topic of debate would not come up at all as she sat down across from Lucinda. "Good day, Lucinda." As she picked up her menu, she noticed that Lucinda had already been served. In fact, it appeared her food was already partially eaten. If she was late, Lucinda didn't even seem to mind as she said, "Good day, Amber. I'm glad you got here on time. I'm afraid I arrived a little earlier than I thought I would. I hope that my call didn't inconvenience you." Amber shook her head as she waited for a waiter to come by. "Not in the least. It had allowed me to make some preparations for later today." She didn't want to mention religion now, but her recent title as High Priestess would only spark an argument. Her thoughts of avoiding that topic were thwarted when Lucinda just nodded and said, "Indeed, I'm sure it takes a lot of work to prepare for a Wiccan ceremony." She looked over the top of her menu and watched as her friend just smiled. There was something in that smile that wasn't there the other time she smiled. It was something unnerving. Amber put her menu down for a moment and just said, "I did not come here for you to make quips at my religion. You said there was a reason to meet, so please get to it." She knew Lucinda was a businesswoman, but even when they went to school together, her friend was always interested in religions, but none more so than Wiccan. She just never understood why her friend always poked fun at it. She was taken aback when her friend just said, "You're right. This was about business, but it is also about religion. There was always something about Wiccan that grabbed my interest. I think it was the fact that almost all other religions have a name for evil. It's just so odd that Wiccan doesn't have that." Being a high priestess in Wiccan, Amber was aware of that fact. She calmly picked up her menu and said, "That's because we believe that if we give evil a name, it makes it more powerful. If we don't name it, it doesn't have that power." She started to look over the menu again, but heard her friend continue, "Odd, but what if the evil has a name? Surely you can't ignore it if it has a name, like Lucifer, Beelzebub, or Mantarok." Amber shivered when she heard the last name. She had heard other names used before, but this was the first time a name made her shiver. She wanted to inquire, but Lucinda just continued, "Let's face it, If you know it has a name, you can't ignore the name. Some would say not saying the name gives it just as much power. Plus, if you add the name into a religion, it gets a grip in that religion. She put the menu down and stared at Lucinda. She knows that some of the people were looking at them now, so she kept her voice down. Even if a name is known, not saying it or even acknowledge it will keep its power down, no matter what. It is strengthening evil to give it a name, no matter if it's something like Tony or something obscure like Man. She stopped there for a moment, as something in her told her not to say the name. Another chill went up and down her spine when Lucinda spoke. You mean as Mantrak. However, you can't deny the name if it is actually what is supposed to be dominant. No matter what, Mantarak is in all religions, except Wiccan. I was hoping you'd help enlighten the Wiccan world, since I am his high priestess. She started to get up, especially when she saw the look in Lucinda's eyes. It had told her that her friend was telling the truth, but there was a deep malevolence in it. She shook her head and then said, I would never, ever do that. It is wrong to give evil a name, but to insert that name just to corrupt the religion, I can't allow that. As she stood, she heard a hiss coming from everywhere in the room, and she again noticed that everyone was staring at them. No, they weren't staring at them. They were staring at her. She chanced a quick glance and saw the waiter was moving towards her, a malevolent look in his eyes. At that moment she heard a sickening sound and looked at the one person near them, except there wasn't a person there anymore. In the person's place, amidst a pile of gore, blood, and ichor, was an inhuman creature, slender, with blades for arms and a horned skull. As she saw it, Lucinda spoke calmly. I had been hoping not to have to do this, but Lord Mantrock needs to get into your religion. One of my bone thieves will help with that in that. At that moment the creature leapt. Luckily she was able to move, and quickly ran through the restaurant and through the door, as more of the creatures exploded out of the people. As she ran, she thought that it could not be happening. She had to be having a nightmare. Unfortunately, the pain in her feet because of her shoes told her she wasn't dreaming. Now she needed to get away, and as she ran she heard Lucinda in the background shout, Get her! Lord Mantalak says we need her, or his return to power will be jeopardized. That did not make her feel better, but as she ran towards the subway station, she saw another fearsome sight. 3 people were running from a car and fleeing a huge creature. That creature was just as unreal as the ones following her, but the people seemed to be heading down into the subway. She was almost leery about heading that way, but a voice said to her, That way will lead to safety. There are those ready to help you down there. She wanted to doubt her sanity now, but something in her told her the voice was right. She looked at the creature, and then took a look back to see the bone thieves, as her former friend called them, catching up. So she did what she felt was right. She rushed down the steps after the others and into the subway station. Alexandra stood patiently close to the end of the tunnel. It was a difficult thing to do, mainly because she knew there were others coming, ones who needed their help. She tried looking out of the tunnel, and all she could see was the large group of people there now. That also meant it might be harder to see the others when they arrive. She sighed and then turned to face the other woman with her, Yvette. The redhead almost had a similar build to her, but since she now had some clothes to suit being an archaeologist, she wore some of those outfits in a way to entice Richard. If they would have had the time, she would have insisted on Yvette changing clothes. Just a bit, at least. She watched as Yvette chanced a glance out the tunnel, and then heard her ask, "Did the goddess give you any idea on what they look like?" She shook her head, and tried to figure out if they could pick them out. Alexandra looked at the Gladius she kept on her at all times now. It was the enchanted one that she used to defeat Pius Augustus almost 6 months ago. Since then it had lost its original glow, but gained a yellow glow. She would still practice with it, and deep down hoped she would not have to use it, especially since it was not very useful on larger creatures. She then looked towards the tunnel entrance again. Well, let's hope there isn't anything like a horror following them. This Gladius may still be enchanted, but I don't want to test how it works on a horror of Mantarok. She noticed that Yvette shuddered at that. I hope we don't see one too soon. After how Richard described the bone thief, I don't want to see horror just yet. She then noticed as Yvette stopped leaning against the wall. I think someone is coming. In fact, it sounds like 4 people running. That news surprised her, and she could see Yvette was surprised as well. They were only expecting 3, according to the goddess. Just at that moment she saw a gentleman her grandfather's age appear, and stopped just for a moment looking at them. He then pointed at them and said to someone behind him, "Right here, James. You get Marlene in there first." She then noticed the gentleman looked as if he were looking a bit upwards. "Ma'am, are you fleeing from something? Good. Follow my student and his friend." Soon she saw a young man close to her age escorting a young lady into the tunnel. The second they entered, she saw a surprised look on the lady's face, before a calming voice radiated in the tunnel. "It's all right. What you had heard on the news about them is a lie." Obviously, the goddess was reassuring the young lady, who she had just noticed how she was dressed. Then the man, who must have been a college professor, escorted another lady in, who must have been her age or older. She noticed a look of panic on her face, but it quickly disappeared as a loud thud started to approach, as well as a hiss and footsteps. Quickly, Alexandra said, "Hurry, head towards that light at the end of the tunnel and pass through. It will take you to the only safe place for right now." She watched as they headed to the point, but the man stopped for a moment and looked at her. "I take it you are Alexandra. Your grandfather was a friend of mine, and he warned me this was coming. It wasn't until your friend approached me that I knew the full extent, and the goddess. I know we are safe with you." It was comforting words to hear, and knowing that this man knew her grandfather was also a good sign. She stopped thinking about that as Vet hurried them along. "We can talk more about this later. We need to get back before we are spotted." She nodded and helped the others get closer to the light. As the others disappeared into the light to be sent back to Enga, she and Yvette froze when they heard a woman's voice shout, "I know you came down here, Amber. I know you came here with others, Lord Amantarak once gone, and don't think someone will come to your aid. I've already masked myself from everyone's view, except my minions, that is. She dared a look back, and saw first a bone thief appear in front of the tunnel, and then a horror. Then the woman appeared, dressed in a business suit, and a look of anger crossing her face. She noticed that all were looking straight ahead, but the woman she recognized as Lucinda Depis. She wondered if the illusion of a wall would hold up, especially as Lucinda turned her head to face them. This close to escape, they could jump through and hopefully seal the tunnel before any of her minions reached them. For a moment she stood still, chancing a glance and seeing Yvette did the same. For a tense moment she saw Lucinda look at her and stare for a moment before turning her head again. Once Lucinda's head turned away, she quickly motioned to the light, and she and Yvette headed through. As they entered, she let relief pass over her, knowing that soon they would be home and safe. She also hoped that it would give them time to figure out their next step.